It began not with a press release, not with an official statement from Buckingham Palace, and not even with a whisper from the Invictus Games Foundation. It began with a single post on social media, the kind of sharp, cutting declaration that hits the public like a rifle shot. The words came from Edward Fortescue, a decorated former major in the British Army and Intelligence Corps, a man who had served in conditions most civilians could barely imagine, who had seen the kind of grit and sacrifice that defined the very spirit the Invictus Games were built upon. His message was short, pointed, and brutal. The wounded veterans of Invictus are done, utterly and irrevocably done, with Harry and that fame-hungry parasite he married. They've seen war. They've faced death. They've dragged their broken bodies through fire and blood. And now they are expected to play supporting roles in the grotesque theater of two narcissists desperate for applause. It was a public execution of trust, a verbal severing of a bond that had once seemed unbreakable. The impact was immediate. Those who had followed the games since their inception were stunned. How could it have come to this? Prince Harry, the very man who had worn the uniform, who had served on the front lines in Afghanistan, who had returned from war with a mission to honor and uplift wounded service members, was now being rejected by the very community he had pledged to serve. The Invictus Games had never been about celebrities, politics, or royal titles. They had been about resilience, about showing the world that injury did not mean defeat, that scars, visible or hidden, were symbols of survival. And yet, according to Fortescue's statement, the focus had shifted. The veterans were no longer the center of attention. They had become, in his words, supporting roles in a spectacle they no longer recognized as their own. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The days that followed were filled with a kind of simmering chaos. Journalists scrambled to confirm whether Harry would still attend the 2027 Games, to be hosted in a city that had invested heavily in preparations. Sponsors quietly began asking questions behind closed doors. On military forums and private veteran groups online, the debate raged. Some believed Fortescue's words were too harsh, that he had allowed personal animosity toward Meghan Markle to overshadow the truth. Others insisted he had merely said out loud what many had been thinking for years, that the games had become more about photo ops and media coverage than about the soldiers themselves. For Harry, the timing could not have been worse. In the months leading up to the games, his public appearances had already been under scrutiny. Critics accused him of using charity work to rehabilitate his image after a series of controversial interviews and projects. Supporters argued he was simply staying true to his passion, that the games had been his brainchild long before his personal life became tabloid fodder. But in the eyes of many veterans, the problem wasn't whether Harry cared. It was whether he understood that the games were no longer serving the same purpose they had in the beginning. The truth was, the discontent had been brewing for a while. Veterans had begun to notice subtle shifts in how the games were presented to the world. In earlier years, the stories told during the event had been raw and unfiltered, focusing on the sacrifices and recovery journeys of the participants. More recently, the media spotlight seemed to linger longer on the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, their arrivals, their outfits, their speeches, and less on the athletes who had fought to make it to the competition. For many who had risked everything in service, this was not just an oversight. It was an insult. And then came the whispers from inside the planning committees. Allegedly, some participants had complained about feeling sidelined during certain events, their moments of recognition overshadowed by surprise royal walk-ins designed for maximum press coverage. Others spoke about the growing sense that the games were being steered toward a polished, branded entertainment experience rather than a deeply personal celebration of recovery and resilience. Whether these claims were entirely true or not didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, perception often outweighed fact. By the time Fortescue's statement hit the digital airwaves, the damage had already been done. His words didn't create the fracture, they revealed it. And they did so with such blunt force that there was no room left for polite denial. Within 24 hours, major news outlets from London to Sydney were covering the story. Headlines blared accusations of betrayal, speculation about Meghan's role in the veterans' discontent, and questions about Harry's leadership. Late-night hosts joked about Invictus becoming invicious, while morning shows invited military commentators to discuss the significance of such a public rebuke. Inside Harry's own circle, the reaction was reportedly one of shock and hurt. Those closest to him insisted he had no intention of making the games about himself or Meghan, that the couple had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to support the athletes. But damage control in a scandal like this is never simple. The problem wasn't just public relations. The problem was trust, and once that was broken between Harry and the veterans, no amount of carefully crafted statements could patch it overnight. The weight of the decision to withdraw from the 2027 Games began pressing down on him almost immediately. On one hand, pulling out would be seen as a capitulation, an admission that the veterans' accusations had merit. On the other, showing up to the event could lead to empty stands, public protests, or an icy reception that would overshadow every medal ceremony and every athlete's moment of glory. It was the kind of no-win scenario every public figure dreads. Either choice would leave scars. Yet beneath the headlines and the heated debates, there was a deeper, more personal layer to this story, one that went beyond public image or media narratives. For Harry, the Invictus Games were not just another royal duty. They were tied to his identity as a soldier, to the camaraderie and mutual respect forged on the battlefield. They were a reminder of the men and women he had served alongside, some of whom never came home. To lose the support of that community was not just a professional setback. It was a wound to the heart. The middle of the crisis was marked by long, tense silences. Harry refrained from public comment in the days following Fortescue's post, leading to speculation about whether he was negotiating with the Games organizers or considering a public apology. The foundation itself issued a carefully worded statement reaffirming its commitment to veterans, but notably avoiding any direct mention of the controversy. Behind closed doors, there were reports of heated discussions, with some advising Harry to attend and face the criticism head-on, while others argued that his presence would only make things worse. In private, Meghan reportedly played a significant role in advising him to prioritize his mental health and avoid walking into what she saw as a hostile environment. Her involvement only deepened the divide between those who believed she was protecting him and those who accused her of driving a wedge between Harry and the very people the Games were meant to honor. Whether fair or not, the narrative was set. Meghan was the lightning rod, the figure who drew as much, if not more, scrutiny than Harry himself. As the final decision loomed, the public began to brace for an announcement. Supporters hoped for a statement that would bridge the gap between the Sussexes and the veterans. Critics anticipated a withdrawal that would confirm their belief that Harry could no longer handle the criticism. What few expected was the quiet, almost understated way the news finally came. There was no grand press conference, no televised address. Instead, word leaked through insider sources. Prince Harry would not be attending the Invictus Games in 2027. The ending of this chapter in the Invictus story was not a fiery confrontation or a dramatic public feud. It was a slow, almost reluctant retreat, one that left behind unanswered questions and a sense of unfinished business. For the veterans who had called for his absence, it was a victory, though a bittersweet one. For Harry, it was a loss that struck at the core of his identity. And for the public, it was another reminder that even the most well-intentioned legacies can be shaken when trust is broken. This is where the heart of the story lies, not just in the headlines or the social media posts, but in the fragile relationship between a leader and those he sought to serve. The road that led to this point is paved with history, hope, pride, and disappointment. And it is only by understanding that road in detail that we can begin to understand why Prince Harry, once the celebrated founder and face of the Invictus Games, has now chosen to step aside in the face of a revolt from the very people the Games were meant to honor. The story of the Invictus Games begins long before the name was ever printed on banners or spoken into microphones. It begins in the dust and heat of Afghanistan, where Prince Harry, then known simply as Captain Wales, served alongside men and women whose lives had been permanently altered by war. He saw firsthand the physical injuries that would never fully heal, the invisible wounds that lingered long after the battlefield was left behind, and the determination of those who refused to be defined by what they had lost. Those experiences planted a seed that would grow into one of the most significant legacies of his public life. In 2014, that seed took form. Inspired by the Warrior Games in the United States, Harry envisioned an international sporting event for wounded, injured, and sick service personnel and veterans. It would be a platform to celebrate resilience and to prove, both to the world and to the participants themselves, that the human spirit could overcome extraordinary adversity. When the first Invictus Games were held in London, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds cheered not just for the winners, but for every competitor who crossed the finish line, regardless of rank or nation. The event carried no trace of pity, only respect, admiration, and camaraderie. The early years of Invictus were defined by that purity of purpose. Every ceremony was focused on the athletes. Every speech was a tribute to their sacrifices. Harry, while undeniably the public face of the games, made a point to keep the spotlight on the participants. His military background lent authenticity. He wasn't an outsider lending his name to a cause. He was one of them. He could talk about early mornings in training, the ache of missing home, the brothers and sisters lost in service, and be understood without explanation. That authenticity forged trust. Each host city brought its own flavor. London in 2014 was intimate, fueled by the novelty of the event and the close proximity of the UK's veteran community. Orlando in 2016 expanded the scale and drew global attention, especially from the United States, whose own Wounded Warrior programs were robust and well-funded. Toronto in 2017 was marked by a warmth that came from a country proud to host both its own veterans and those from across the globe. Sydney in 2018 showcased an unmatched enthusiasm, with the city's waterfront venues providing a stunning backdrop for competition. Everywhere the games went, it left behind stories of personal triumph, communities coming together, and lives being changed. The athletes who participated often described the games as life-saving. For some, it was the first time they had felt part of a team since leaving active duty. For others, it was an opportunity to set goals again, to push their bodies beyond the limits imposed by injury or illness. Families were just as involved, traveling with the athletes, sharing in their struggles and victories, and often finding support among others who understood their unique challenges. The games didn't just rebuild confidence, they rebuilt connections. Harry's role in those years was more than ceremonial. He was often seen mingling with competitors, offering words of encouragement, attending training sessions, and sharing quiet moments away from the cameras. Those who knew him then spoke of his genuine investment in the people behind the medals. He wasn't afraid to shed a tear in public when hearing about the hardships someone had overcome, nor was he above laughing at himself when joining in on adaptive sports he wasn't trained for. This was the Harry the veterans loved. Approachable, relatable, and committed. The early media coverage reflected that sentiment. Articles focused on the athletes' backstories, often giving just a passing mention to Harry's presence. Photographs captured the grit of competition, the embrace between teammates, the pride in a parent's eyes. Sponsors lined up to be associated with such a positive and inspiring event, and governments were eager to offer their cities as future hosts. There was a sense of momentum, of something rare and untainted in the world of high-profile charity work. It wasn't all without challenges, of course. Organizing an international multi-sport event required significant funding, logistics, and coordination. There were occasional disputes over budget allocations, scheduling conflicts, or disagreements between national delegations. But those issues stayed behind the scenes, handled quietly to protect the game's reputation. The athletes and the public saw only the finished product, a celebration of resilience and unity. The mission was simple but powerful. To harness the power of sport to inspire recovery, support rehabilitation, and generate a wider understanding of the sacrifices made by those who serve their countries. That mission was enshrined not just in the official materials, but in the hearts of everyone involved. It was what made the games feel untouchable, immune to the cynicism that so often creeps into charitable endeavors. In those formative years, the Invictus Games became more than an event. They became a movement. Nations competed fiercely, but with an undercurrent of mutual respect that often saw competitors cheering for their rivals. Spectators came away changed, inspired to see the possibilities of life after devastating injury. And Harry became more than a prince or a former soldier. He became a symbol of what could happen when someone used their platform to lift others rather than themselves. It is against this backdrop of success and sincerity that the current tensions become so stark. To understand the depth of today's conflict, one must first remember just how pure and unifying the Invictus mission once was. These games were not born from political maneuvering or personal branding. They were born from shared hardship, mutual respect, and a belief in the indomitable human spirit. And for a time, that belief was unshakable. But even the strongest foundations can be tested. The same authenticity that had once bound Harry and the veterans together would later be the measure against which they judged him. The trust they had placed in him during those early years would become the very trust they would accuse him of betraying. The memory of those first games, filled with raw emotion and unfiltered pride, would be the standard to which every future event was compared. And in the eyes of many, recent years had fallen short. The origins of the Invictus Games remain a powerful reminder of what can be achieved when purpose is clear and egos are set aside. They also serve as a painful contrast to the divisions that would emerge later. To fully grasp the weight of Harry's withdrawal from the 2027 Games, one must hold both truths in mind: the nobility of the beginning and the complexity of what followed. Only then can we see how something so celebrated could find itself at the center of such deep and personal conflict. The turning point was not a single event, but a gradual shift, the kind you only notice when you stop and compare the present to the past. In the early years of the Invictus Games, the focus had been sharp, unwavering, and deeply personal. Every detail, from the way the opening ceremonies were conducted to the media coverage surrounding the athletes, had reinforced the idea that the Games existed solely to honor wounded, injured, and sick service members and veterans. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, cracks began to form in that carefully maintained image. One of the first signs came from within the veteran community itself. Athletes who had been part of the Games from the beginning started to voice quiet concerns during informal gatherings and private conversations. These were not complaints made to stir trouble or to discredit the event. They were observations from people who cared deeply about its mission. They noticed that the media was beginning to frame the coverage differently. Instead of leading with the competitors' stories, headlines increasingly led with Harry's arrival, Meghan's outfits, or the celebrity guests in attendance. For many veterans, this shift in focus was subtle but unsettling. They had not signed up to be background characters in someone else's narrative. As the Games grew in size and prestige, so too did the corporate sponsorships and media partnerships. With each new deal came new expectations. Higher production values, tighter schedules, and more attention paid to how the event looked on television or in glossy magazines. While there was nothing inherently wrong with growth, some veterans began to feel that the intimacy and authenticity of the early Games were being lost. Where once the priority had been ensuring that every competitor's story was heard and honored, now there were moments when it felt as though the schedule bent more toward high-profile photo opportunities and VIP meet and greets. The veterans weren't blind to the realities of funding and publicity. They understood that large-scale events required money and attention to survive. But there was a difference between using visibility to uplift the cause and letting the cause become secondary to the spectacle. The latter was what they feared was beginning to happen. In candid moments, some spoke about feeling like they were part of a brand rather than a movement, their images used to project an inspiring message while their actual voices were sidelined. There were also whispers about changes in the internal dynamics of the Games organization. Some longtime staff and volunteers reportedly left after clashing with newer hires brought in to professionalize the event. These departures were rarely publicized, but among those involved in the Invictus community, they were noticed. The concern was that the heart of the Games, the people who had been there from the start, who knew the athletes and their families personally, was being replaced by individuals whose focus was on marketability and strategic branding. Around this time, Harry's own life was undergoing massive changes. His marriage to Meghan Markle in 2018 marked a new chapter, one that brought both unprecedented global attention and intense scrutiny. As their public image became a constant topic of conversation in the media, the Invictus Games began to be mentioned more frequently in connection with their personal story rather than as an independent cause. For some veterans, this was a red flag. They worried that the games were becoming intertwined with the couple's public brand in ways that could overshadow its original mission. It didn't help that Harry's relationship with the British royal family became increasingly strained, culminating in his and Meghan's decision to step back from royal duties in 2020. While this move was deeply personal and rooted in complex reasons, it had a ripple effect on every public endeavor Harry was involved in, including Invictus. The media now covered his appearances at the games through the lens of royal family drama, often framing events as opportunities to analyze his standing with his relatives rather than to highlight the competitors. The veterans, who had fought hard to keep politics and personal feuds out of the games, began to feel that the event was slipping into territory it was never meant to enter. By the mid-2020s, the changes were no longer subtle. At the games themselves, some athletes privately expressed frustration over the scheduling of ceremonies and media moments that seemed designed to maximize coverage of Harry and Meghan rather than the competition. While official speeches still centered on the athletes' achievements, the structure of certain events made it clear where the spotlight was intended to fall. Even if this was not Harry's direct intention, the optics suggested otherwise. There were also cultural tensions. Meghan's presence brought a new kind of celebrity attention, particularly from American media outlets. This in itself was not a problem. In fact, it expanded the game's visibility. But some veterans felt that the tone of the coverage was shifting toward lifestyle and entertainment rather than the raw, unvarnished stories of recovery and perseverance. For a community that had built the games on authenticity and mutual respect, this shift felt like a betrayal of the founding principles. The first real public hint that all was not well came when a handful of veterans quietly opted not to return for subsequent games. Their reasons were often given as personal or logistical, but within the community, it was known that at least some were walking away because they no longer felt connected to the mission as it was being presented. These were not people seeking attention. Many of them refused interviews or declined to make public statements. Their absence, however, spoke volumes to those who noticed. Behind closed doors, organizers were aware of the growing tension. Efforts were made to address concerns, but as with many large-scale events, competing priorities often meant that compromises had to be made. In some cases, those compromises satisfied no one. Veterans who had been with Invictus from the start began to feel like their voices carried less weight in decision-making. Staff who pushed for a return to the original ethos sometimes found themselves overruled in favor of strategies that promised bigger audiences or more lucrative sponsorships. Harry himself was walking a tightrope. On one side was his deep personal commitment to the games and the athletes. On the other was the reality of being a high-profile figure whose every move was dissected by the press, balancing the needs of the veterans with the demands of public life, particularly one that now extended far beyond the UK, was proving to be more difficult than it had ever been. And all the while, resentment within certain corners of the Invictus community was hardening into something less forgiving. By the time Edward Fortescue's words went viral, the groundwork for such a statement had been laid over years. It was not the outburst of a single disgruntled veteran, but the culmination of a slow, steady erosion of trust. The early signs had been there. The shifting media focus, the changes in internal culture, the quiet departures of key figures, the veterans who chose not to return. The tide had been turning for some time. It just took one blunt, unfiltered statement to make it impossible to ignore. The second chapter of this story is not about scandal in the explosive sense, but about a change in atmosphere. It is about how something pure and tightly bound by shared purpose can start to fray when competing interests and public scrutiny seep in. The Invictus Games had not yet reached a breaking point during this period, but they were drifting toward it. And in hindsight, that slow drift was perhaps the most dangerous part, because no one could say exactly when the change became irreversible. When Meghan Markle entered Prince Harry's life, the world's attention on him intensified in ways even he could not have fully anticipated. Her arrival brought not only the glow of Hollywood glamour, but also the sharp edge of celebrity scrutiny. The Invictus Games, which had grown steadily since their inception, suddenly found themselves pulled into a much larger narrative, one that was less about wounded warriors and more about the lives, choices, and controversies of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. For some, Meghan's presence was a breath of fresh air, injecting new energy and global visibility into the games. For others, it marked the beginning of a shift that would slowly change the event's soul. Megan's first official appearance at the Invictus Games was in Toronto in 2017, before she and Harry were even married. The media frenzy surrounding her attendance was unlike anything the Games had experienced before. Photographers lined the venues, tabloids churned out articles about her outfit choices, and entertainment reporters, many of whom had never covered the Games, descended on the event to get a glimpse of the couple. The veterans noticed the change immediately. The quiet dignity that had been the hallmark of Invictus was now accompanied by an undercurrent of paparazzi chatter and celebrity gossip. When Harry and Meghan married in 2018, it seemed inevitable that she would play a visible role in his charitable endeavors. She brought with her a network of contacts from the entertainment and fashion industries, an instinct for media engagement, and a polished public speaking style. In theory, these qualities could have amplified the Game's message to a wider audience. And in some ways, they did. International coverage of Invictus surged, particularly in the United States. Sponsorship offers increased, and the Games gained a level of recognition among audiences who previously had no awareness of them. Yet for all the benefits of this heightened profile, there were complications. Meghan's involvement inevitably shifted some of the media spotlight from the athletes to the Sussexes as a couple. What had once been an event where Harry could disappear into the crowd of veterans now became a stage where every move they made was documented, analyzed, and, in some cases, criticized. The Games became part of the royal couple's public image, woven into the same narratives that dominated headlines about their personal and professional lives. Some veterans appreciated Meghan's efforts. She took time to meet competitors and their families, listened to their stories, and often spoke warmly about their courage. She was praised for her poise and for helping draw attention to causes related to mental health and rehabilitation. However, others were less convinced. They felt that her presence, however well-meaning, brought an element of spectacle that was at odds with the spirit of Invictus. They worried that the authenticity of the event, the unfiltered celebration of recovery and perseverance, was being diluted by the gloss of celebrity culture. The concerns were not just about media optics. There were logistical changes too. According to accounts from some within the organization, security protocols were tightened significantly when Meghan attended, sometimes causing disruptions to the normal flow of the Games. Areas that had once been freely accessible to athletes and their families were now restricted, and some competitors privately voiced frustration at feeling like they were navigating a high-profile royal event rather than a community gathering of peers. These adjustments, while perhaps necessary from a security standpoint, subtly altered the atmosphere. Meghan's approach to public engagement also contrasted with Harry's. While Harry often thrived in unscripted interactions, moving easily among athletes and speaking candidly, Meghan tended to participate in more structured, choreographed appearances. Her style was professional and polished, but some veterans missed the informality that had characterized earlier Games. For them, those unplanned moments, sharing a laugh over a failed attempt at wheelchair basketball, or chatting casually before a race, were part of what made the event feel genuine. As the years passed, Meghan's role in the Games became more pronounced. She was involved in promotional efforts, appeared in official videos, and, in some cases, helped shape the narrative of the Games in media interviews. While her intentions may have been rooted in support, her presence was inseparable from the controversies that surrounded the Sussexes in their broader public life. Every positive headline about Invictus risked being accompanied by a negative one about their personal disputes with the royal family, the press, or other public figures. The turning point came when Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties in 2020. The decision, and the ensuing media storm, meant that every appearance they made was viewed through a new lens. For Invictus, this meant that the Games were no longer just a sporting event for veterans. They were also a platform for a couple who were redefining their roles outside the monarchy. To some veterans and supporters, this blurred the lines uncomfortably. The Games, once a refuge from politics and publicity battles, began to feel like another arena in which those battles were being played out. Behind the scenes, there were murmurs from organizers and participants about whether the focus of the Games was shifting. While the event still showcased incredible stories of resilience, Those stories sometimes seemed to be competing for space with narratives about the Sussexes' relationship, their future projects, or their latest public statements. Sponsors loved the attention Meghan brought, but the veterans, many of whom valued privacy and humility, were wary of the trade-off. By the mid-2020s, the division in opinion about Meghan's role was clear. Some saw her as a committed advocate whose presence had elevated the game's profile and brought in vital resources. Others saw her as a distraction, a figure whose celebrity threatened to overshadow the very people the games were meant to honor. This divide mirrored the broader public split over the Sussexes themselves and began to seep into the Invictus community in ways that would later prove difficult to repair. The growing unease did not explode into open conflict immediately. For a time, the goodwill Harry had built through years of dedication helped keep tensions in check. But the seeds of discontent were there, quietly germinating. Every instance where an athlete felt overlooked, every moment when media coverage prioritized Meghan's presence over a competitor's victory, added to a sense of frustration. And as public controversies involving the Sussexes mounted, it became harder to separate their personal brand from the Invictus Games' identity. In hindsight, Meghan's entry into the Invictus narrative was a pivotal moment. It brought undeniable benefits, funding, visibility, and new audiences, but also introduced vulnerabilities that had never existed before. The games were no longer just Harry's project. They were, in the public eye, a shared endeavor of the Sussexes. This perception, whether fair or not, would shape how future controversies involving either of them would impact the veterans and the event itself. And as history would soon prove, that connection would become both a powerful asset and a dangerous liability. Edward Fortescue was not an unknown name in British military circles. A former major in the British Army and a seasoned intelligence officer, he was the kind of man whose words carried weight, not because of fame, but because of the life he had lived. His career had taken him into the most demanding and dangerous situations. He had commanded men in high-pressure environments, worked alongside allies in covert operations, and earned the respect of soldiers who valued competence and integrity above all else. When such a man speaks, especially about matters of honor and loyalty, his voice is not easily dismissed. That is why, when his statement about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle appeared on social media, it landed with the force of a detonation. It was a short post, barely more than a paragraph, but its impact was immediate. He wrote that the wounded veterans of the Invictus Games were done, utterly and irrevocably done, with Harry and the woman he called a fame-hungry parasite. He accused the Sussexes of turning a noble endeavor into a grotesque theater, with the veterans relegated to supporting roles in their relentless quest for applause. It was a brutal statement, stripped of diplomacy or hesitation. Fortescue did not attempt to soften his words or leave room for interpretation. His meaning was clear. Whatever bond had once existed between Harry and the veterans was broken. The post spread rapidly, amplified by the credibility of its author. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times across X, Facebook, and veteran forums. Screenshots appeared in WhatsApp groups among military personnel. Former service members began adding their own comments, some in agreement, others urging restraint. The media picked it up almost instantly. Online tabloids ran sensational headlines. Broadsheet newspapers framed it as a serious and troubling development, and talk radio shows began inviting veterans to share their perspectives live on air. What made the statement so explosive was not just its content, but the fact that it confirmed what had, until then, largely been whispered in private. For years, some veterans had quietly voiced their frustrations about the changing nature of the Invictus Games, but few had been willing to go on record. Fortescue's public declaration broke that silence. It gave legitimacy to grievances that might otherwise have been dismissed as the opinions of a small, disgruntled minority. Now, those grievances were front-page news. The language he used struck a nerve. By describing the veterans as having dragged their broken bodies through fire and blood, only to be used as background for celebrity drama, he tapped into a deep well of resentment. These were people who had sacrificed their health, their peace of mind, and in some cases their careers in service to their country. They had fought hard to rebuild their lives, and they saw the games as a celebration of that fight. To feel that they were being reduced to props in someone else's image-building exercise was, for many, intolerable. Not everyone agreed with Fortescue's assessment. Some veterans and supporters of the games argued publicly that his comments were unfair, that Harry had given years of his life to the cause and continued to support the athletes behind the scenes. They pointed to the resources, media attention, and funding that Harry and Meghan's involvement had brought to the games. Without that visibility, they argued, Invictus might not have grown into the global movement it had become. But these defenses, while passionate, were drowned out by the sheer volume of voices rallying behind Fortescue's critique. The reactions from the general public were equally divided. Supporters of Harry and Meghan accused Fortescue of personal bias and questioned his motives. Critics of the couple saw the statement as vindication of their belief that the Sussexes were more interested in self-promotion than genuine service. Social media turned into a battleground of hashtags and opinion threads, each side certain they held the moral high ground. Inside the Invictus Games organization, the mood was tense. Fortescue's words had not only inflamed public opinion, but also created uncertainty about the upcoming 2027 games. Organizers were now faced with the possibility of a veterans boycott, something that could severely damage both the spirit and the credibility of the event. Sponsors, sensitive to public sentiment, began making quiet inquiries about the stability of the game's leadership and the likelihood of negative publicity. In high-level meetings, contingency plans were discussed, plans that included the possibility of Harry stepping back from a visible role to preserve the event's integrity. Harry himself remained silent in the immediate aftermath, a decision that some interpreted as strategic and others as evasive. Friends later suggested that he was deeply hurt by the statement, particularly because it came from someone with a service background. He had always believed that his own time in the military gave him an unshakable bond with veterans, one built on shared experience and mutual respect. To have that bond publicly questioned by a figure like Fortescue was a personal blow. For Meghan, the fallout was equally intense. Her name had been included in the statement in the most cutting of terms, and media coverage inevitably highlighted that detail. Every prior criticism of her involvement in the games was dredged up, from claims about her overshadowing the athletes to speculation about her influence over Harry's decisions. In the court of public opinion, the narrative was quickly forming. She was at the center of the veterans' discontent, whether fairly or not. In the weeks following the post, more veterans began speaking out. Some echoed Fortescue's sentiments, sharing their own frustrations with how the games had evolved. Others pushed back, saying that whatever disagreements existed, airing them so publicly risked undermining the very mission they had all worked so hard to advance. This public airing of grievances was unprecedented in the history of Invictus and made it clear that the community was deeply divided. The media, sensing the drama, kept the story alive with daily updates, interviews, and panel discussions. News programs invited military experts to analyze the potential fallout. Columnists speculated on whether Harry's reputation as this soldier prince could survive the hit. Even international outlets weighed in, with some foreign commentators framing the controversy as part of the larger debate over the Sussexes' role in public life after leaving the royal family. What made the situation particularly volatile was that there seemed to be no easy resolution. The veterans' concerns were not about a single incident that could be addressed with an apology or a policy change. They were about a gradual erosion of trust, a feeling that the games no longer belonged entirely to them. And trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, especially when it has been shattered in such a public way. By the time the immediate storm began to subside, the damage was done. The idea that the veterans themselves might refuse to participate in the games if Harry remained involved had entered mainstream conversation. The Invictus Games, once celebrated as a shining example of unity and resilience, were now associated with division and controversy. And for Harry, the man who had built the games from the ground up, the question was no longer whether he would lead them into 2027. It was whether his continued involvement would cause them to unravel completely. The warning signs had been mounting for months, but the veterans' breaking point arrived with a sudden, unmistakable clarity. In the days following Edward Fortescue's public statement, conversations that had once been whispered in private rooms began spilling into open forums and closed-door meetings. The veterans who had devoted themselves to the Invictus Games, many of whom had competed multiple times or served as mentors to newer athletes, were no longer simply expressing frustration. They were issuing ultimatums. If things did not change, if the focus did not return fully to the competitors rather than the public image of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, they would not attend the 2027 Games. For an event built entirely on the participation of wounded warriors, such a threat was not just symbolic, it was existential. The veterans' anger was not born from a single incident. It was the result of years of small slights, unaddressed concerns, and a sense that their voices were not being heard. Many recalled specific moments when they had felt sidelined. There was the athlete whose medal ceremony was delayed because a high-profile guest had arrived late, forcing the competitors to stand in the sun for an extra 20 minutes while photographers captured the VIP entrance. There was the double amputee who had trained for months only to find his event overshadowed by a surprise press conference featuring the Sussexes. There were the families who had traveled across the world to support their loved ones, only to be turned away from certain venues because they didn't have the right media credentials, while celebrity guests were escorted inside without question. These incidents, while perhaps not intentionally disrespectful, carried a heavy weight for the people experiencing them. Veterans, particularly those who had served in combat, were accustomed to an environment where respect was earned through action and where no one's sacrifice was more valuable than another's. The perception that their contributions were being used as a backdrop for someone else's narrative was corrosive. It undermined the sense of equality and camaraderie that had been the heart of the Games from the beginning. The sentiment among many competitors was that the Invictus Games had started as theirs, a sanctuary where they could compete, heal, and connect without the constant noise of politics or celebrity culture. Now, they felt that sanctuary slipping away. Fortescue's words had simply stripped away the last layer of restraint, giving others the courage to say what they had been thinking. The Games no longer felt like they belonged to the veterans. They belonged to the brand. In small gatherings, the talk turned from frustration to action. Some proposed a public statement outlining their grievances, while others favored a quieter but equally powerful approach, a boycott. They reasoned that without the athletes, there could be no Games. If they withdrew, the event would be forced to confront the fact that its foundation was crumbling. This was not a threat made lightly. For many of these men and women, Invictus had been a lifeline, a source of renewed purpose after the chaos of war and injury. To walk away would mean giving up not just on a competition, but on a community they had helped build. Organizers were quick to recognize the seriousness of the situation. Behind the scenes, frantic calls were made to veteran representatives, trying to gauge the depth of the unrest. What they found was alarming. This was not the discontent of a handful of outspoken individuals. Entire national teams were voicing similar concerns. Representatives from Australia, Canada, and several European countries reported that multiple athletes had indicated they would not travel to the 2027 host city if the current trajectory continued. The veterans' breaking point was not just about media coverage or ceremonial snubs. It was about trust. They felt that the leadership of the Games, including Harry himself, had stopped listening. In the military, leaders are expected to stand shoulder to shoulder with their troops, to share in their hardships and victories equally. When that sense of shared mission breaks down, the bond is difficult to repair. The athletes no longer felt certain that the man who had founded Invictus was still in the trenches with them. Some of the most vocal criticism came from those who had once been Harry's staunchest defenders. They spoke with a mixture of disappointment and sadness, recalling the early days when he would spend hours talking to competitors away from the cameras, when he knew not just their names but the details of their recovery journeys. Now, they said, it seemed as though his time at the Games was divided between scheduled media appearances, private sponsor meetings, and carefully choreographed moments that left little room for genuine interaction. The possibility of a boycott sent ripples through the Games infrastructure. Sponsors began quietly reviewing their contracts, calculating the risk of attaching their brand to an event mired in public dispute. Host city officials, who had invested millions in preparing for the 2027 Games, began asking pointed questions about whether the event would deliver on its promises. For the first time since its inception, the Invictus Games faced the prospect of not being able to fill its roster of competitors, a scenario that would not only be humiliating but potentially catastrophic for its reputation. Harry, meanwhile, was placed in an impossible position. To ignore the veterans' grievances would be to risk losing the heart of the games entirely. To address them publicly would require confronting accusations that cut to the core of his identity as a leader and advocate. Worse still, any move he made would inevitably be filtered through the polarized lens of his and Meghan's public image. If he took responsibility, critics might frame it as an admission of guilt. If he defended himself, he risked deepening the rift with the very people he claimed to champion. Within the veterans community, there was no single demand that could neatly resolve the crisis. Some wanted Harry to step back from the public face of the games entirely, allowing the event to be led by a coalition of veterans. Others called for Meghan to have no official involvement, believing that her association was a major source of tension. Still others simply wanted a return to the original ethos of Invictus. A focus on the athletes, their families, and their recovery stories, without the layers of spectacle and branding. The mood grew increasingly resolute. The veterans knew that their absence would speak louder than any press release. In their view, they had already sacrificed enough in service to their countries. They would not allow their participation to be used in service of a narrative they no longer believed in. The choice was clear. Either the games returned to being about them, or they would no longer be part of it. By the time this sentiment solidified into action, the pressure on Harry was immense. The 2027 games were still months away, but the logistical timelines meant that rosters needed to be finalized soon. Every week that passed without a resolution made it more likely that entire teams would withdraw. The threat was no longer hypothetical, it was real, and it was growing. The breaking point had been reached, and there was no going back to the way things had been. Harry now stood at a crossroads. He could fight to hold his place in the games and risk presiding over a fractured, diminished event. Or he could step aside, a decision that would be seen by some as an act of humility and by others as a surrender. Either way, the Invictus Games would never be the same, and neither would his relationship with the people he once inspired. When word of the potential boycott reached the media, it was as if a slow-burning fire had suddenly been doused in gasoline. The story, already simmering from Edward Fortescue's scathing public statement, exploded into a full-scale media storm. Headlines blared from every corner of the news industry, each one crafted to draw maximum attention. Veterans ready to walk away from Prince Harry's Invictus Games. Soldiers turn their backs on their former captain. Wounded warriors reject royal leadership. The narrative was compelling in the most damaging way. It pitted Harry, the founder of the games, against the very community he had sworn to champion. The tabloids wasted no time in framing the drama in stark, almost cinematic terms. They published side-by-side photos. On one side, a smiling Harry in uniform from his deployment days. On the other, images of athletes in wheelchairs or on prosthetic legs, their expressions serious. The juxtaposition was deliberate, intended to make readers question how the bond between these two worlds had fractured so badly. Online, social media platforms lit up with debate. Hashtags trended worldwide, some in support of the veterans, others defending Harry and Meghan. Twitter threads dissected every public appearance the couple had made at past games, analyzing body language, timing, and focus. Instagram accounts began reposting old photos of the game's earliest days, captioned with nostalgic reminders of what Invictus had once been. Mainstream broadcasters devoted primetime segments to the unfolding crisis. In the UK, popular morning programs invited veterans to speak live on air, their voices carrying the weight of lived experience. Some shared stories of the games as a life-changing event that had lost its way. Others expressed regret, saying they never imagined they would reach a point where they considered not competing. Across the Atlantic, American networks approached the story differently, often framing it as part of the larger saga of Harry and Meghan's post-royal life. While sympathetic to the veterans' grievances, some U.S. commentators questioned whether the backlash was amplified by existing hostility toward Meghan in certain parts of the British press. The intensity of coverage meant that every minor development was treated as breaking news. When one national veteran team spokesperson confirmed they were reviewing their participation, it became the lead story on multiple news sites within minutes. When an anonymous source claimed that several sponsors were privately considering withdrawing, it was splashed across tabloid front pages the next morning. Even rumors, unverified and often speculative, took on a life of their own once they entered the media ecosystem. The pressure on the Invictus Games Foundation was immense. They issued a carefully worded statement reaffirming their commitment to the athletes and the mission, but conspicuously avoided mentioning the boycott threat directly. To the media, this omission was a story in itself. Analysts debated whether the silence signaled an unwillingness to confront the crisis or a deliberate attempt to de-escalate tensions. Either way, the lack of a definitive response from Harry only fed the frenzy. Public relations experts began weighing in on talk shows, offering unsolicited advice to the Duke. Some argued he needed to make a heartfelt, unfiltered statement addressing the veterans' concerns directly, without scripted talking points. Others believed his best move was to quietly negotiate behind the scenes and let the issue fade from the headlines. The challenge, they agreed, was that the controversy struck at the core of his identity. Harry was not just a patron of the games. He was their founder, the embodiment of their mission in the public eye. Any public fracture between him and the athletes risked permanently damaging both his reputation and the event's credibility. Meanwhile, the veterans themselves were caught in the eye of the storm. Some had never spoken to the media before, but now found reporters waiting outside their homes or contacting them through social media. A few chose to speak out, repeating their concerns about the games losing their original focus. Others refused interviews, wary of being drawn into a narrative they could no longer control. The veterans who did speak were often quoted in ways that amplified the most critical elements of their statements, further fueling the sense of division. The storm was not confined to the English-speaking world. In countries with significant veteran communities, the story was picked up and reframed according to local perspectives. In Australia, commentators emphasized the deep ties between their military and the British Armed Forces, expressing disappointment that such a rift could develop. In Canada, where Harry and Meghan had briefly lived after stepping back from royal duties, the story sparked debate about whether the couple's personal brand had overshadowed their charitable work. Even in non-Commonwealth nations, the Invictus Games had enough name recognition that the controversy made headlines. Inevitably, the coverage began to dig deeper into the Sussexes' broader history with public institutions. Articles revisited past disputes with the British royal family, their criticisms of the press, and controversies surrounding their other charitable projects. The implication, subtle or otherwise, was that the Invictus situation was part of a pattern, a narrative of high-profile beginnings followed by public fallout. For Harry, this framing was especially damaging because it undermined the image he had built over years as a steadfast advocate for veterans. The transition from a celebrated royal bride to a figure at the center of one of the monarchy's most polarizing controversies was not a sudden fall, but a slow, visible unraveling. In the beginning, Meghan Markle's entry into the royal family carried the weight of symbolism. She was a successful actress, a self-made woman who had built her own career and name long before marrying Prince Harry. Her mixed heritage and American background were seen by many as a breath of fresh air in an institution often criticized for being too insular, too bound by centuries-old tradition. The wedding itself was broadcast to millions across the globe, with moments carefully chosen to blend royal protocol with personal touches that spoke to her identity. The day was supposed to mark a turning point, the dawn of a modern monarchy that could embrace diversity without losing its sense of continuity. Yet even during those early months, there were faint warning signs that this fairy tale might not endure. Reports began surfacing of disagreements between Meghan and palace staff, whispers of a demanding working style and frustration over restrictions on her public role. At first, these were brushed aside as teething problems. Any new member of the royal family would need time to adjust. But the British tabloid press, known for its relentless appetite for royal drama, seized upon every rumor, every perceived breach of tradition, and amplified them into headlines that dominated front pages. Small incidents, like a comment about a tiara choice or an adjustment to a royal schedule, became magnified into symbols of deeper tensions. By the time Archie was born, the relationship between Meghan and the British press had deteriorated beyond repair. Coverage became increasingly adversarial, with stories portraying her as both an outsider unwilling to adapt and a disruptive force within the family. Meghan's supporters countered by pointing to examples of double standards in the way she was treated compared to other royal women, arguing that race and nationality played undeniable roles in the hostility she faced. The palace maintained its customary silence, adhering to the never complain, never explain ethos, but behind closed doors, the strain was evident. Meetings were held to address the growing rift between the Sussexes and the institution, but the gap only widened. The breaking point came in January 2020 when Harry and Meghan announced, without prior approval from the palace, that they would step back as senior royals and seek financial independence. The statement, posted online for the world to see, caught senior royals off guard and triggered an emergency summit at Sandringham. For the first time in living memory, a senior royal couple had effectively resigned from the institution, and the monarchy was forced to navigate uncharted waters. The terms of their exit included the loss of their HRH styles and day-to-day use and the cessation of official royal duties, but they retained their Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles. This compromise was meant to allow them to maintain a symbolic link to the family while giving them the freedom they claimed to need. However, the years that followed saw Meghan and Harry embark on a path that repeatedly intersected with, and often clashed against, the monarchy's carefully curated image. High-profile interviews, such as the one with Oprah Winfrey, contained allegations that shook the palace to its core. Claims of racism within the royal household, discussions about mental health struggles, and frank criticisms of the firm were broadcast to millions, sparking both sympathy and outrage. For Meghan's supporters, she was a courageous truth-teller exposing the harsh realities of royal life. For her critics, she was undermining an institution that had welcomed her and given her a global platform. Commercial ventures added another layer of complexity. Multi-million-dollar deals with streaming platforms, book projects, and public speaking engagements blurred the line between personal enterprise and the prestige conferred by royal titles. Each time Meghan was introduced at an event as the Duchess of Sussex, debates reignited over whether it was appropriate for someone who no longer served the crown to leverage that association for personal gain. This was the core argument that began to resonate in political circles and among members of the House of Lords, the idea that titles were being used in a context that served neither the monarchy nor the public, but rather the individual holding them. Meanwhile, the relationship between the Sussexes and the rest of the royal family remained strained. Public appearances together were rare and often marked by visible awkwardness. Behind the scenes, trust had eroded to the point where private conversations were tightly guarded for fear of leaks. Meghan's decision to attend certain high-profile events while skipping others fueled speculation about ongoing disputes. Harry's memoir, with its candid accounts of family tensions, only deepened the divide. Each revelation became another brick in the wall, separating the Sussexes from the institution they had once been central to. For Parliament, these developments provided a mounting case for action. By the time the petition in the House of Lords was drafted, there was a well-documented history of Meghan's public departure from royal life and her subsequent activities that could be used to justify the move. Supporters of the petition pointed to the contrast between her role as a working royal and her life now, arguing that the disconnect was too great to ignore. The issue was no longer just about public relations. It was about the integrity of the monarchy as an institution in the eyes of both the British public and the Commonwealth. The fallout from this period was not only institutional, but deeply personal. Meghan had gone from being hailed as a transformative figure within the monarchy to being at the center of a formal parliamentary action to strip her of her titles. The journey from her wedding day to this point was marked by moments of triumph, disillusionment, and open conflict. Each step along the way had contributed to a narrative that Parliament could not easily overlook, and each controversy had chipped away at the case for allowing her to retain the symbols of a role she had left behind. The petition might have been the trigger, but the decision to move forward with stripping Meghan of her royal titles was rooted in a series of moments that, when placed together, painted a picture of a relationship between the Duchess and the monarchy that had gone beyond repair. The breaking point was not a single explosive scandal, but a collection of actions, statements, and public moves that, in the eyes of many within the institution and Parliament, crossed a line from independence into open defiance. This slow accumulation of tension created a climate in which decisive action was no longer viewed as optional, but as inevitable. One of the most significant turning points came in the wake of the couple's televised interview with Oprah Winfrey. It was not just the content of the conversation, though that was damning enough in the eyes of the palace. It was the global reach and emotional impact of what was said. Meghan spoke openly about her struggles with mental health and feelings of isolation, alleging that pleas for help were ignored by the institution. She hinted at discriminatory attitudes within the royal household, and while she stopped short of naming names in certain instances, the implication was enough to ignite a storm of commentary. For the monarchy, which thrives on discretion and the careful control of public image, the airing of such grievances to an audience of millions was viewed as a deep breach of the unspoken pact between the royals and the crown. The interview became a dividing line. Supporters lauded Meghan for her honesty and courage, while critics accused her of waging a public campaign against an institution that had conferred upon her one of the highest honors it could bestow. Parliamentarians who would later back the petition began quietly taking note of the contradictions between Meghan's claims of seeking privacy and her participation in globally broadcast media events. In their view, such moves blurred the distinction between personal catharsis and the calculated use of royal identity for influence and opportunity. Tensions deepened when the Sussexes embarked on a series of commercial projects, each carrying price tags in the millions. A multi-year production deal with a major streaming platform, book publishing arrangements, and paid speaking engagements at high-profile conferences were all announced within a short span of time. In isolation, these would have been unremarkable for any public figure, but for a member of the royal family, especially one who had stepped back from duties, the optics were volatile. The persistent use of the Duchess of Sussex title in promotional materials and public appearances became a rallying point for critics. To them, it was evidence that Meghan was trading on royal branding while rejecting the responsibilities that came with it. The publication of Harry's memoir added another combustible element to the mix. Although the book was written in his voice, Meghan's presence loomed large in the narrative. Personal anecdotes, grievances against senior royals, and intimate family moments were laid bare in a way that further eroded the already fragile trust between the Sussexes and the rest of the family. In Parliament, some saw this as confirmation that the couple's royal titles were being used as a shield against criticism while they engaged in activities that could actively harm the monarchy's reputation. Beyond the high-profile interviews and media projects, smaller incidents also chipped away at the perception of Meghan as a former working royal who maintained a respectful distance from the institution. Comments made in podcasts and speeches occasionally strayed into territory that touched on the royal family or British society in ways that stirred political sensitivities. Invitations to high-level events in the United States and abroad were sometimes extended specifically because of her title, and the petition's supporters argued that this influence was precisely what needed to be curtailed. Within the palace, each of these developments was closely monitored, though public comment was rare. Senior aides kept detailed records of media appearances, noting how often her royal title was used and in what context. Reports compiled for internal review outlined patterns of behavior that could be cited in any formal argument for revoking her privileges. The concern was not only reputational but constitutional. While the monarchy is largely ceremonial in modern Britain, the association of titles with certain types of activity could blur the lines between state neutrality and personal enterprise. The final push toward the breaking point came during a series of public engagements in the United States where Meghan was introduced repeatedly as the Duchess of Sussex while speaking on topics that touched indirectly on British governance and policy. Although nothing she said directly violated any legal boundaries, the optics were enough to alarm those who believe the monarchy must remain above even the appearance of political entanglement. These events were seized upon by the petition's architects as clear examples of why retaining the title was untenable. When the petition's language was finalized, it made specific reference to this pattern of public engagement, tying it to broader concerns about the integrity of royal titles. It argued that titles should not be used in contexts that could be construed as partisan or commercial in nature, particularly when the holder had stepped away from official duties. The case was presented not as a punishment for past actions, but as a preventative measure to safeguard the monarchy's credibility.